Hello, and welcome to another episode of Meet the Music. I'm your host, Thomas Corley, and welcome to our series on Christian music, the many styles of Christian music. Today we have Dr. James Goff. He is a professor of history at Appalachian State University. He's also serves as the chief historical consultant for the Southern Gospel Music and Hall of Fame and Museum. He is the author of Close Harmony, a history of Southern gospel, kind of the reference that we're using for today's discussion. I mean, so there is so much Christian music out there. You can call it spiritual, you can call it hymn, choir, chorus, Bible camp songs, contemporary gospel. But today we're going to focus on Southern gospel. Dr. Goff, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for your time. So with all of that, I mean, your book is considered a reference book, and with the 400 plus pages they say that's in there. So why don't you just give us a quick, or not even necessarily quick, just give us a historical perspective of the music for someone who's just being introduced to it.
Okay, I'll begin and kind of go backwards a little bit, oddly enough, because the term Southern Gospel confuses people. It really didn't emerge as a term until the late 70s. As the Gospel Music Association became more complex, different styles of music that when I was a boy growing up, we called contemporary gospel. And then you begin to get, sort of influences from the rock and roll era, and then by the 80s you get metal, and you just get, and of course ultimately rap. I mean, and so what happened, I think, is that young people who oftentimes, as they do, dominate the markets, and they dominate thus the award shows ultimately, and a lot of the traditional groups began to feel like they were being left out. And so what the Gospel Music Association did, politically, like most groups, was they began to categorize the music so that the sort of older stars and the style of black gospel, the older stars and styles of white gospel quartets, the sort of, the different styles were all being recognized. And what emerged out of that was Southern gospel, which had been, or was understood to be at the time in the late 70s, the sort of traditional 3 to 4 part harmony group, primarily white, but not always. It was already integrated by then. But that was the focus, that sort of tight harmony. And that's why I call my book Close Harmony, because I think that's one of the enduring sort of contributions of that music. But if you go back earlier into the 1950s, you looked at a publication like Billboard. They didn't have all these categories. They talked about spiritual music and sacred music, and the audience knew what they were talking about. The spiritual music was essentially coming out of the black community, and the sacred music was coming out of the white community. But
I didn't know that.
Yeah. That's those are the only terms you ever saw in Billboard in the 50s. Now the groups behind the scenes were borrowing from each other, listening to each other, but sometimes because they were on stages together, sometimes because they just knew about these groups and they would buy their 78s, and they admired each other and they sang each other's songs. For instance, one of the best known gospel songs, I wouldn't call it Southern gospel because I think it's much bigger than that. One of the best known gospel songs of the 20th century was written in the early 30s by the great gospel songwriter Albert E. Brumley. And we all know it as I'll Fly Away. It's just been recorded well over 600 times by all types of gospel artists and country artists and folk artists, and to some degree even pop artists on occasion if they want to do something sort of retro. But Albert E. Brumley is this sort of white traditional quartet gospel guy coming out of Southern Missouri and Western Arkansas. He sort of got started with a little company near Fort Smith, Arkansas, called the Hartford Music Company, and he learned how to write. He learned how to sing. Another song that folks almost always know is Victory in Jesus by a great gospel songwriter named E.M. Bartlett. Well, E.M. Bartlett took the great Albert E. Brumley under his wings when Brumley was a little boy, let him come to his school for free. And so Brumley worked for Bartlett. And then Brumley became one of the great gospel songwriters. He preferred writing to singing. So, I mean, you got a list of just huge numbers of songs. If We Never Meet Again, Turn Your Radio On. I mean, you can go on and on with the Brumley story. But I'll Fly Away is a good example of how these songs were just gospel songs. And then, people sort of fall in love with them and they sing them and they create them in their own styles. And then they sort of lose that Albert E. Brumley connection as such. Of course, it's fine because the Brumley Music Company continues to get, the royalties from all of those. So they love
Right.
for a song to cross these genres. That tells us something very important about all of gospel music. I mean, it comes out of the 19th century. It comes out of the church. It comes out of the camp meeting. It comes out of the city urban revivals. All of those things influence. And the other thing that I think is oftentimes lost on us today is that when gospel music in the 19th century was born, it was always participatory. It was not entertainment in the way that it would become with the coming of radio and television and now the internet and everything else. People sang because they wanted to be a part of something. And in rural societies throughout the South in particular, there were these singing societies, and singing schools where people would learn to sing. Southern gospel has a unique background in what was called shape notes. And if you look at some of the old hymn books, you'll see that, there's 7 different shapes. And so you could buy a songbook and it would be printed, songs would be printed in round notes. But if the table of contents says shape notes, the people who had learned to read those shape notes and sing a song, it was a shortened form of reading music, in effect, sort of reading music for the singer. It made no difference to the person maybe playing piano because if they're looking at the scale, it's the same. But for the singer, if they learn that shift, that mathematical difference between one shape and another shape, the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, and they could go back and forth between re and fa and do and sa. They could learn a song almost instantly.
Wow.
And so what happens is you go to a singing school and you learn shape notes, and then you go back into your community and you sing in a singing society, or maybe you sing in your church. But by the 30s, you've got the first sort of really important in a series of sort of technological shifts. The first had actually been printing, I think, because a lot of people, if they grew up singing hymns in church, they know what a chorus is, the chorus of a song. But choruses were actually created in the 19th century, participatory singing of gospel, because a lot of people couldn't read. And so if you went to a camp meeting, either you couldn't read or you couldn't afford to buy songbooks, because publishing itself was expensive until after the Civil War. It's really not until the 1880s when you get sort of cheap printing. So if you think about it like that, the choruses of our songs, or the choruses of the songs that were made popular in the 19th century, came along so that the one person who could read and one person who maybe had the music, they would sing the verses and everybody would join in. It's like a call and response, it's like a what in the Appalachian Mountains they called lining out, so that everybody could participate in this community event. So gospel evolves that way, first of all. Things begin to change once more people can read and once more people can afford to buy the music. But the big one from the standpoint of entertainment is radio. Radio develops in the 1920s, And as it does, these people that had become the best of the singers in these singing societies, local venues, they began to get gigs on the radio, and they become stars on their own, in their own right. People hear them. And so you begin to get the beginnings of a transfer between a focus on the music and participation to a focus on entertainment by the best singers. Um, and then, of course, it translates into recordings and then television, and it comes all the way up to the present day. In some ways, Tom, I think we've lost something there. I mean, people who have a church to go to or belong to some local singing organization, they sing, but a lot of folks don't sing. So they don't learn to sing harmony. They don't, they might sing what they hear, they mirror what they've heard in their favorite style of music. But I'm talking about actually getting a brand new piece of music and learning how to sing a new song, which was the fun part of what people were doing in the late 19th, early 20th century.
Yeah. It's interesting as you say, because you pointed on, you touched on quite a few things that had me sitting here thinking as you were speaking. And one of the things that you mentioned was the hymnal or the hymns. And I grew up in a small church, and the small church that we had a blue hymnal that we always pulled out during the course of service.
Right.
And now I'm about to turn 60, and I am at a church. I'm at a mega church, and and now I stand up, I clap, I might sing, but it's like you said, it's not for me to join in.
Yeah,
it's the praise and worship time period is not for me to join in.
You're right, Tom. What's really lost in that, because like you, I grew up in a church, and I learned how to sing. I never learned the shape notes, but I did learn how to sight read. So as I grew up, I used to experiment. I would try, if it was a 4-stanza hymn, I'd sing the lead on one verse, and then I'd try to sing that alto line, and then I'd try to sing the tenor line, and then try to sing the bass line. That was a way of learning, And of course, I was better at some parts than others. But the thing about church today, I go to a church much like you do, in that nobody does that anymore, because number one, you don't see the music, you see the words up on the screen, and you might, and so, people are singing along, or at least they're encouraged to sing along maybe, but they don't really think about it like people back 100 years ago did. Right. In terms of the exciting new songs and learning parts and harmonizing. It's one of the things I really grew up loving about Southern gospel, was that tight harmony, that close harmony. So anyway.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that, because that your perspective on the historical part was very enlightening for me, because I learned a couple of things out of that. So what was the spark to write your book 20 years ago now to be to consider a reference book by some of the reviews I read?
Well, that's nice to hear. I got into Southern gospel. I think that as a historian, a lot of times we write about obviously things we know, but to some degree we write to learn about ourselves. My first book was about Pentecostalism, because I grew up in a Pentecostal church. So then my second book, which was the Southern Gospel book, was because I grew up singing in church, and I knew that Southern Gospel had interested me as a boy. I loved that harmony. I had watched the music adjust and change. I love the contemporary gospel of the 1970s, groups like the Imperials, Andre Crouch and the Disciple, as the sort of simple designations of black gospel and white gospel had begun to sort of get more complicated, and they learned and they borrowed. And as American society became more open, then these things were made available to us in terms of groups being integrated and music being available and being able to buy much more easily than we had in the past. So I was influenced by that, and it was about 1992 or 93, I'd been here at Appalachian about 5 or 6 years, and my wife and I were listening to the radio, and a gospel song came on, and it was one of those classic quartet songs with the high tenor and the low bass, and then the two middle parts, and they're harmonizing. And what Southern gospel folks used to call convention songs sometimes were these songs that were rolled out at these singing conventions, and they were like a giant puzzle. If you follow me, the four different parts would sing something new, and then one might go off on one direction and echo another, and then by the end of the song, they all come back together. So, I mean, that was just the style that a lot of people loved. And we were just talking about, what are you going to do on your next project? And my wife said, why don't you write on music? That's something you've always loved. And I started doing some investigating, found out that a magazine by the name of Singing News, which dated back to the 60s, had moved here to Boone just about the same time I did, about 1986, 1987. And so the records were here. And so I started going over to their office and reading through the old magazines and beginning to get my feet wet. And that was the beginnings of that. Okay. And then I began to interview people. I got some support from the Singing News magazine. They were interested in forming a museum, which they ultimately were a part of. Southern Gospel Music Association was formed. But I came along at the right time, and it was something that I knew a little bit about, and I wanted to know more, and I knew how to ask the historical questions. Right. There's another part of it, and this is hard for people who aren't gospel music fans to understand, but sometimes I was sort of intimidated, but then I was excited too, because I was interviewing people and getting to know people that had been sort of stars in my mind, almost like musical idols when I was a boy. I remember the first time I met J.D. Sumner, the great bass singer, backed up Elvis Presley the last 5 years of his life. And I'd seen J.D. when I was a little boy singing his really low notes on television. And I remember it. I'm a grown man. I mean, I'm in my late 30s by this point in time. And I remember walking up to JD and wanting to speak to him, and then just not being able to say anything, in time, of course, I did. I got to know JD. I considered him a friend. I think he considered me a friend. Last time I talked with him, which wasn't long before he died, and I'm getting ready to leave the bus. He was in failing health, and I was working on the museum at that point in time. And he was at that time the president of the SGMA. And I didn't know if I'd ever see him again. As it turned out, I didn't. At least in this life, I didn't see him. And so I said, JD, I'll see you later. And he looked at me and said, I love you, buddy. And I knew he meant it, and sure. that was the neat thing. I think it was to get to know folks and get to know them as human beings and feel close to them. I got to know a lot of them at the twilight of their career. That's always nice for a historian, because they want to be remembered. They want people to understand them, and they have the time, Sure. People who are building their careers were sometimes harder to interview because I was a nuisance. But for the older folks, I really fell in love with them, and just enjoyed the fact that I had gone from being a young man looking at these people as if they were almost unapproachable, and then coming to know them and feel like, I wanted to see them again, speak to them, let them know how my family was, find out how they were doing. That was the fun part, sort of behind the scenes. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. That's very touching. So I was going to ask you a question about, well, let me just go ahead and ask you this question. Mm-hmm. The museum, you made mention of it. How did you become a part of that?
The Singing News had asked me, because they knew I'd been around for several years, and I was coming over to their office and reading their old magazines and borrowing old tapes and stuff of music, And they said, we want to build a museum at some point. We might be able to use your work. And so I got a little bit of a wild hair there. I'd gone to a workshop where you talked about grants, and so I asked them. I said, well, if you would be interested in maybe sponsoring my research, then I would have travel money and they said, well, yeah, write up a proposal. So working with the university, we wrote up a proposal, and the Singing News, I think it was ultimately something like $35,000. That was back in the mid 90s, which gave me what I needed to travel, interview people, and have a little bit of time off from my teaching responsibilities to be able to start working on this book. Of course, the other thing that they gave me was just as valuable, and that was they gave me a set of credentials. I mean, I remember in 1996, Bill Gaither had just been doing these homecoming videos for 2 or 3 years, and they were just starting to take off. So one of the first places I got to go do interviews after the connection with the Singing News was in his hometown up in near Anderson, Indiana. And I went to a Bill Gaither homecoming taping, and here are all these people that I'm wanting to talk to. They're all in one place at one time for several days. And so for a historian, it was like, wow, I've died and gone to heaven here. Everybody I want to talk to, and of course, I got to know Bill and Gloria and just a lot of other people that were super nice. But where the Singing News came in important was I had a Singing News badge on. Now, they knew I was a historian. They knew I didn't work for the Singing News or that. I worked at the university. But it gave me credibility because at that point in time, the Singing News was at one point, I think in the late 90s, Tom, it was the best selling, the widest distributed music magazine in the entire country. They sold over 200,000 copies a month. That's how loyal. That's how loyal these. I mean, much bigger than the Music City News or the Rolling Stone or anything like that. I mean, these are just dedicated. Well, one reason it was that way is because, like a lot of things, Southern Gospel was a niche business. So if you wanted to know about Southern Gospel, the Singing News was one of the few places where you could get that information, find out where groups were going to be, how you could get your tickets, and what the big songs were. So just their sponsorship gave me credibility. And I spent most of the late 90s doing the interviews, finishing that, and then starting to write the book. Now, you asked about the museum. Here's where sometimes things happen that you don't anticipate. I was about halfway through with the book in 1997 or something like that, 98, I think it was. And the Singing News owner, a man by the name of Maurice Templeton, came to me and he said, look, we've got this Southern Gospel Music Association form now, and we're ready for you to help us with the museum. And at first he thought it was going to take a long time. And that was, I said, sure, I'll finish the book and then we'll do the museum. But then what happened is the Dollywood organization stepped in and offered a home for the Southern Gospel Museum and Hall of Fame. Starting, and we opened our doors in the spring of 1999. That relationship, by the way, with Dollywood just ended. So the Southern Gospel Music Association is now relocating to its own standalone facility in Pigeon Forge. It's still in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. But it's actually in transition. But for over 20 years, we were associated with Dollywood, and what that did was it just put it on a fast track. So I literally put the book aside, and I think they came up with some more money and said, okay, we want to buy you out of your teaching for a little while so you can work on this. And the university was really great to work with me. I think I had another semester, so I put together a museum.
Wow.
I had a lot of technical help. There was a museum company out of Nashville that I would say, can we do this? And they'd say, oh, sure. I mean, they knew how to do it. I just knew the history by this point in time.
I mean, but you were the curator basically, though, right? Or
Well, I was the consultant who, I mean, I wrote everything that went into that museum. All of the descriptions of the items. I decided what should go in and what shouldn't. Now, once we got it built, then of course they hired a director, and the director took care of that. And then they would just call me from time to time, and I volunteered for the next 20 years to give advice if and when they needed it, essentially.
oh,
Um,
okay.
but out of all that, I got to meet Dolly Parton, which was kind of cool. And I mean,
Uh-huh.
found out that absolutely one of the smartest women I've ever met. I met her one morning and walked her through the museum when it was brand new. That was opening day, and she's very behind the scenes, very humble, very understated. And then that afternoon, we met with the press, and she turned the switch on and became Dolly Parton. And it was really amazing to watch, Tom. Just
Right.
how a person that talented. But what I was impressed with, she knew everything I told her that morning.
Yeah.
Didn't
Yeah.
didn't miss a beat, and she knew how to play. An old country boy like me. I mean, she knew how to just kind of play off. I mean, she's just absolutely fantastic. And
Yeah.
I just marveled. I mean, it was great.
I of course I have never met her, but what I see of her, on the screen, whether it be TV, YouTube, or movies, I
Mhm.
get that impression
Yeah,
from her. And then when she does interviews, she's so humble and and uh, loving. She projects so
she
much
is.
love when
Yeah.
she shares with her. So she's a class act, no doubt.
She is very genuine. I remember my wife and I were there. I mean, my wife was with me. She said, you got to take me on this. This was one thing I did that I think somehow sort of impressed my wife after many years of marriage. And but the one thing I remember, Tom, was right in the middle of all this. I'm showing Dolly something about singing schools and singing school teachers, and she stopped me and she said, "My grandfather was a singing school teacher. If I got something, do you think we could put it in this museum?" I mean, she was dead serious, just as humble. And I'm sitting there thinking, "You're Dolly Parton, and this place is called Dollywood. Why are you asking me?" I mean, but of course, I said, "Sure, absolutely." You know. So anyway, but she wasn't kidding. I think she's
Yeah.
just, as you said, very genuine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks for sharing that story. That was wonderful.
When you get as old as me, you have lots of stories.
Yeah. So I mean, so we have. I mean, okay. My listeners will probably get tired of me, and they'll probably turn the volume down when I talk about this. There's a website out there called everynoise.com, and it's kind of sponsored by Spotify, the streaming service. And if you go on there and you do a search on a list, find on the page and type in gospel, there's like 37 different gospel categories. And then if you do um, worship, there's like 23 different categories. Now, granted, all of these are sometimes related to a country. I mean, I've seen something that says samba gospel. I've seen something that says Ghana or South Africa or Canadian gospel. Um, what do you see? I mean, how do you see the world when it comes to spiritual or Christian music?
Well, what you described makes sense to me as a religious historian. I mean, I
Hmm.
started as a religious historian and I got into religious music. But music music is something that's difficult to sort of qualify in that it speaks to our soul. And so every generation, I think, uses music. If you think back to spirituals, you think back to hymns and hymn singing. You think back to the radio. Even today, people from my generation, they hear a song on the radio, and it takes them back maybe to a high school dance or to somebody they dated. I mean, music has a way of really speaking to our soul. All right, so So spiritual music, in that sense, should be the most important kind of music. One of my favorite quotes, by the way, did come from J.D. Sumner. When I interviewed him, he was talking about the criticism that he sometimes received for singing secular music, because when he backed up Elvis, they were singing all kinds of stuff. Sometimes gospel, obviously, because Elvis loved gospel music, but they sang the Elvis songs, what the crowd wanted to hear. And JD really got just as serious. And in fact, he got tears in his eyes when he talked about it. He said, all music is God-given. Gospel music is the dessert. And I thought, well, how appropriate, I mean, music speaks to us. Gospel music, though, for those of us that are believers, gospel music gets to the heart of it, because it's about the salvation story. It's about God's love for humanity. It's about a son given freely, and it's about grace, something you don't deserve. But so that kind
it's
of
the
music,
truth.
yeah, that's the secret, I think. And so it really doesn't matter the style. People argue about whether it's orthodox, whether it's biblical, and I get that. That's an important conversation to have. But music at its best speaks to the soul. And if the message is true, as you suggested, if the message is true, if it's the gospel message, then that's what makes gospel music live, because it's bigger than just remembering that high school dance or remembering that girl. It's remembering why we're here. And,
Yes.
and whose we are. I mean, so there you
go. Yeah. So, if you look back on the decades, and you get to a point where, like Thomas Dorsey, and Mahalia Jackson, and how they kind of, say bluesy or whatever, but and then you get to Andre, and his Hammond is a Hammond organ. Is that what it's called?
Mm-hmm.
Hammond, yeah. So when he gets away from that, some people say, well, he lost his religion.
Same thing happened throughout Southern gospel, and even long before they called it gospel, there were debates about guitars, debates about drums, debates about all of this, and of course, music is about adapting. It's about adding. It's about contributing. It's never supposed to stay the same. If it stays the same, I think it dies. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So true. Mm-hmm. And that's why, I don't want to say I'm preaching, but I'm always on my soapbox about the fusion of music. Right. And, and when you look on it, I mean, it's just really the commercial side of the music where it becomes categorized and, boxed in and genre style. Because if you go back over 100 years, it was just music. And people sang what they wanted to sing. And all of a sudden, when it got to be commercialized, that's when we started getting these different genres or styles of music.
Well, because somebody else is calling the shots, and somebody's trying to market it. Yeah.
Market it. Yeah. Right. Yeah. All right, sir. So let's run through your list there for our listeners who are trying to get their feet wet and dip their toe into the lake.
Well, I know a whole lot more about the old gospel than I do the new gospel, I suppose, even in Southern. There are things that are my personal favorites, but if you really want to hear some of the old stuff, then you got to go to the groups like the Blackwood Brothers and play maybe a song like "Lord, Build Me a Cabin in Glory," or any number of songs. They did them all. The Blackwood Brothers dated back to 1935. A black gospel group like the Golden Gate Quartet that crossed over into what later would be known as Southern Gospel. They left the United States in the 1950s, but they sang on stage alongside the Blackwoods, alongside the Statesmen. The Golden Gate did a great version of Swing Down Chariot, and they were just absolutely phenomenal. And I would say you got sort of country tinged groups like the Chuck Wagon Gang, and they did everything, just over and over again. Um, but I, you know, it's just hard to say in any specific. I mean, one of the first really big songs was "Give the World a Smile," which came out in the late 1920s by a group called the Stamps Quartet, and then that became the theme song on a lot of radio shows. It had a bass lead when you got to the chorus, and it was something like "Give the world a smile each day," and then it would be echoed, "A smile every day, helping someone on their way," and so groups would do it because that was the theme. That was the theme of the Stamps Baxter Music Company coming out of Dallas, Texas.
Mm.
Um, you know, in the period of the 70s, when I was growing up and just really loving the new stuff, my favorite group was the Imperials. They had started as kind of a traditional Southern group, and they had expanded and moved. They had a huge song called "Sail On" in the late 70s. Love that song. I mean, if you want to, and they were one of the first sort of Southern gospel groups to really become mainstream. They were on the Mike Douglas show, if you remember that, from
Okay.
the 1970s. Uh, Southern gospel continued. As I told you earlier, it's not called Southern gospel until the late 70s. So by the time it gets that moniker, you get to a group like Gold City. One of my favorite gospel songs is called "The Midnight Cry" from about 1987. You want to hear beautiful harmony and a beautiful message, "The Midnight Cry." Uh, Midnight Cry reminds us of a sort of a perennial theme within Southern gospel, and that is that this world is not our home. That Christ is going to come back, and there's going to be so. Uh, Jesus is coming soon. And a huge song. It was actually an old song that was resurrected and became a big hit for the Oak Ridge Boys in the about 1969, 1970, long before they thought about moving into country music, which they
Right.
ultimately did. Yeah,
Right.
but those are just a few of mine. There was a group in the 60s and 70s called the Rambos that were quite influential and unique. They had the advantage of being a family group, so family groups could survive because of the budget. They didn't have to pay each other like they did the sort of groups that come together. Seriously, there's a lot of turnover in quartet music because you'll usually have one or two people that own the group, and they're trying to pay everybody else on salary in order to make ends meet. But if you get a family group, then they're all contributing to the product. But the Rambos had another ace in the hole, and that was Dottie Rambo, one of the great songwriters. So you get Dottie and the Rambos, "Build My Mansion Next Door to Jesus." Just a song after song after song that nobody else got first because
Right.
Dottie was writing. So those are some of my favorite sort of marks. I look at Southern gospel today. That there's still good groups out there. You can find a traditional group like the Triumphant Quartet. If you want to hear traditional Southern 4-part harmony, group like Triumphant is as good as it gets, I guess. Ernie Haas and Signature Sound. Ernie had been a tenor for the great Cathedral Quartet that had sung from the 60s on through the 90s. You can look up most anything by the Cathedrals. If it's dated from the 90s, you had a couple of veterans, George Yance and Glenn Payne, that dated from the 30s and 40s, and they're still singing and just really knew how to put that 4-part harmony group together.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
I had a, yeah,
are,
go ahead.
go ahead. No, I was going to ask you a question about your relationship with some of these artists. Do you know, or have you heard from any, or have you seen any who might be, I don't know, on hard times from this whole pandemic situation, where they had to
Um,
give up their career?
not that I know of in terms of giving up their career. I think where it really has hurt groups are groups that were sort of regional and local groups trying to make a living. I think
Yeah.
the groups that had more established record contracts and things like that, they were able to work in the studio, maybe do some songwriting, some things that they hadn't done before. I'm sure
The
that
creative
yeah,
process.
yeah. I mean, there's one of the big Southern gospel groups today is called the Kingdom Heirs, because they're the host group at Dollywood. Now, I'm sure they took a big hit because for a long time Dollywood was closed, but Dollywood kept their employees around, and then as soon as they could reopen, they did. So groups like that had something they could go back to. But the smaller groups that survived on churches and small concert venues, I suspect they have taken the biggest hit. And of course, some of them had jobs on the side anyway, and they may have sort of temporarily given it up. But just like everybody else, this has been a really, really tough time.
Yeah.
So
Well, you know what? You mentioned grant writing. I'm gonna have to tap you as a resource, because I'm going after the National Endowment of Arts
now
and
you're
get
getting into
them.
some big money, Tom. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, you
get them
really
to
are.
give up the fork out, give us a truck so we can travel the country and get these artists back on, on stages.
Yeah,
And get
one group,
a delegation.
if people want to hear a really good group, and they don't, they don't want to just side one little group. But one of the really good groups is Bill Gaither's Gaither Vocal Band. Now Gaither's in his 80s now, and he really came to fame in the 60s as a songwriter. And when I grew up listening to the Bill Gaither Trio, they were not Southern gospel. They were contemporary. That's what they did. They did sort of the earliest version of praise and worship music. Had a huge album called Alleluia in the late 60s. But Bill, when his brother and his wife didn't want to tour anymore, Bill formed a group called the Gaither Vocal Band, and he had the clout and the contacts to put together some of the best voices in the business. And that's why I'm saying, if you want to hear the best voices coming, just listen to any song pretty much by the Gaither Vocal Band. There have been several iterations of them, but they still sing, and Bill still knows how to put talent together. No doubt about it.
Well, yeah, I kind of saw. I don't know. I mean, I'm assuming it's him. I mean, I just saw Gaither as a name, and then I
Yeah.
saw some gentleman behind him. But I saw that he was still still out there.
Still singing. He was of course, I thought he was old when I met him, but he was younger then than I am now, so I've learned better. But but Bill's extremely talented songwriter, and he knows talent, and that whole homecoming video thing has been phenomenal for Southern gospel and really gospel music in general, because it's not just Southern gospel. He brings together people from different gospel genres, because it's really about the music. It's about the songs that have touched our hearts over the years.
By chance, are you familiar with the record sales for that genre of music, or the touring? I should say the touring for that genre of music. Do you know if they're internationally
Yeah. One of the
tours?
things I learned, and of course, we're talking about late 20th century when I was doing my research, but one of the things that caused Southern gospel to emerge as a separate genre was that the big groups, like the Imperials, were doing a form of music that was selling better. So whereas most Southern gospel groups were selling maybe 50,000 of a product, the Imperials are coming along in the 70s and they're selling maybe 300,000 of a unit. So I mean, they're moving into sort of popular music territory in terms of what they're able to do. So one reason why I think the industry focused more on contemporary is because it sold better. I mean, yourself, in the end, that's what made the difference. And so contemporary gospel got bigger and bigger. And then these new forms of gospel came along, and Southern gospel became a little bit more insular. There were some bitter feelings, I'm sure. And from what I've read, this mirrors the story of the traditional Black gospel artists. Of course, Black gospel had its own story about artists. You mentioned Aretha Franklin. Of course, Sam Cooke also falls into this category. People that had left gospel and gotten into popular music and the money, and they were sometimes criticized. But on the other hand, I think
Yeah. Right.
it was a little different for the black community, because while they may not have liked Sam maybe singing secular music rather than gospel, they were proud of him, and they enjoyed the fact that here, this is success. So they saw it as maybe good in the larger scheme of things. You don't quite have that, I think, in the dynamic of these white gospel groups. For instance, one of the best known groups when I was a boy was the Oak Ridge Quartet. I mentioned a little earlier. They dated to the 40s, founded by a guy named Wally Fowler, the one who really made them famous. So the Oak Ridge go country in the 70s and start touring with Johnny Cash and people like that. And they were just absolutely excoriated within the gospel music community. And I mean, you see this with some of the early black gospel artists, but I don't think there was any forgiving spirit for at least a very long time. We've lived long enough now. It was interesting. One of the things that the Southern Gospel Music Association did just a few years ago, so probably dates back to about 2008, 2010. They gave an award to the Oak Ridge Boys. And I think it meant a lot to those guys to be recognized once again because of the hard feelings that had come along when they left gospel.
Right.
By the way, you saw the same thing in contemporary gospel when Amy Grant went pop. Absolutely. So church folks sometimes feel like they've been stabbed in the back when their best and brightest go off to make money somewhere. And and so it's that's a universal sort of thing that we've had to deal with. But it's funny because the people that never sang gospel for a living got a pass. For instance, Elvis Presley got a pass. See, because he was secular first. So if Presley sang gospel songs, that was good.
Right.
But because the Oaks and Amy and others had been in gospel and had become known in gospel, it was seen as sort of leaving us, turning their back on us. Yeah. So it's different though, I suppose now. And I think that's one of the good things. I think gospel music has come to be understood as a unifying factor. So many groups within the popular music world have been influenced by gospel. You don't have to scratch very many people from my generation, at any rate, and begin to talk about where'd you learn to sing. Even Kenny Rogers, by the way, just passed away last year.
All right.
I was reading his autobiography, and I didn't know this, but I was struck to find out that he traced his harmony singing. He's one of the best known of the duet folks. Sang with Dolly, sang with Sheena Easton, sang with others. And he said, I learned how to sing harmony in church.
Yeah.
That he's known as a soloist, but there's this other part of him that loved good harmony singing. And I won't go on and on this, but there's a part in the book that I'll never forget. He said he's sitting in church as a little boy. He's sitting by his sister, and he heard something, and he said, "What is that?" And it was harmony. He was hearing those parts come together and mix. Mm-hmm. And he said, it's something I never forgot. And so he liked being a part of a group. And of course he was early in his career,
I was thinking
first edition. He was actually in a jazz group.
No way.
He played bass. Bobby, I'm gonna have to look up the name, but yeah, he's in a.
I did not know that.
Yeah, and then of course Kenny Rogers in the first edition, but Kenny was very and of course for a while, folks in the country field didn't like Kenny coming in, but in the end, success wins people over, doesn't it?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
And he had the perfect voice for some of those songs that he sang.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I think it was something like the Bobby Dole 3 or something like that he sang with for 8 to 10 years when he was he grew up in Houston. He was a kid on the streets, urban. He's not rural. He came from the city. So
yeah. Well, as long as gospels, whatever you want to call it, whether it be rap or contemporary or whatever the case may be, or Southern, the key is it's got to have the message.
It does, yeah.
It's
And
got to have the message.
those have been the biggest fights of substance. I think there's a genre of music that comes on my radio on Sunday morning. They'll do some sort of traditional gospel, and then they do what they call positive music. And
Okay.
I like some of it, but other parts of it I don't. And the biggest criticism in there is that it's not, the message isn't explicit. So the traditionalists want the gospel message to be there. That even though we may fight about some of the theological interpretations, and people didn't like some of Albert Brumley's sort of simplistic messages and stuff. It was too country, too cornpone or whatever. I even heard people complain about Bill Gaither's "The King is Coming" because it didn't fit their understanding of the second coming in terms of the way they thought it was going to be and the biblical interpretation. But I'm not really talking about that. I'm talking about a more substantive concern about gospel being about the gospel message, about a savior, and
Right.
about a sacrifice, and about redemption and the offer of God's love. So gospel will thrive as long as the message is the true message, is I think the word you
Yes.
used
Yes.
earlier. Yeah.
Yeah. I agree. Yeah.
But if it's just about feeling good, or that can only go so far. That might make you feel good, but it doesn't speak to your soul.
Exactly. Right. Right. Yeah. Well, sir, I truly, truly thank you for the conversation, because as always, for me, these sessions are eye opening, and being a sponge. I don't want to be a rock. I want to be a sponge when I have these conversations. And so I absorbed a lot here, and I truly appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Tom. I really do. I've enjoyed talking with you. I've learned from you too. So thanks.
Yeah. So, do you have anything up and coming?
I'm actually working on a religious biography of Elvis Presley.
Is that right? Wow.
Yeah, I should have had it done years ago. I mean, I actually thought about it as my doctoral dissertation many years ago, and my advisor wisely told me Elvis isn't going anywhere. This was like 5 years after he had died, and now it's been, of course, that much longer. But there's been so many things written about Elvis, but one of the things I learned, the reason I wanted to finish this, and I've gotten tied up with some administrative duties, put me back, but that all comes to an end next year. Elvis grew up Pentecostal, like I did. Went to an Assemblies of God church, and his favorite kind of music was gospel music. And he loved all forms of gospel, but he especially liked the 4-part harmony quartet music. If you think about what Elvis did, he backed himself up. He had a black gospel group, he had a white gospel group, he had a choir. I mean, it had an orchestra. I mean, he loved all of these sounds. So what I would like to do is look at, and Elvis's story is fascinating, in part because it's tragic. So part of it is to look at Elvis in his boyhood, going to church, Sunday school, the music he loved, and his life and the decisions he made. There's an early part of his life. Elvis thought he wanted to be a preacher. And he certainly wanted to be a gospel singer. That was he made no bones about that.
Right.
And in the end, he went a different direction, maybe for all the reasons one could understand. But it's kind of trying to get to the religious part of that, and trying to figure out how America has changed during that same time period. If you look at what was happening in America from Elvis's birth in 1935 to his death in 1977, the growth of the Pentecostal movement, the changing voice of gospel that we've been talking about, very, very different. And so Elvis lived through that. And I just think there's a story to be told about how Elvis is, not that he was a prophet. I'm not saying anything like that.
Right.
I just think he symbolizes a lot of important changes in the religious culture of the United States during that period.
Well, I have to believe there's an audience for that because, like you said, it is a different perspective of Elvis that
Yeah,
no one has
yeah.
tapped into. Yeah.
I never met Elvis, but I met a lot of people who sang with him and knew him, and so every time I did an interview with somebody like that, I'd ask those questions, just hoping I could get some more insight. So that's where that's coming from.
Oh, great, great, great. Well, again, the book is Close Harmony, A History of Southern Gospel. Dr. Goff, thank you so much for joining Meet the Music.
Thank you, Tom. I've enjoyed it.
Man, that was a wonderful episode. That was a prime example of why I do this podcast. I want to thank Dr. James Goff Jr. for sharing the history and his personal stories and adding to the series on the many styles of Christian music. Please be sure to share this episode or one of our others in this series on Christian music. You can listen to the show on our website at meetthemusic.buzzsprout.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much for joining us on our musical journey. Remember, if it's Monday, it's Meet the Music.